part of what holds us back, I think, is the sense of fear, not just distrust of the system, but the fear of the word cancer. Some people will not even say the word.
Yes.
Some people will not share the information with their families. As a 11-year-old kid growing up at the time, I got very sick. I had a right hip issue. I went to Mandeville Hospital. I wasn't quite sure what was wrong. And back then, you know, kids were not told much of anything. I was transferred to UC Hospital in Mona. And there I came under the care of a Professor John Golding, an orthopedic surgeon. And I spent 5 months in the hospital, 5 months with a plaster cast on from my chest down to my toe. So essentially I couldn't sit up. And multiple operations, multiple drainages, multiple transfers from UC to Morant Bay Hospital because I was not allowed to be discharged to home. And during that time period, I saw a tremendous amount of things that maybe a child shouldn't see. But what I want to emphasize in Professor Golding is that he, for me, was more than just an orthopedic surgeon. I distinctly remember him walking into my room to make rounds with his team. And he turned to someone, I think maybe either a nurse or social worker, and says, "Now, isn't this boy supposed to be sitting in his common entrance?" And they said, "Yes, but that time had passed." And he said, "See what you can do. Write to the Ministry of Education and see, before the results come out, if he can sit this common entrance exam himself." And they did. And I sat the examinations at the Ministry of Education. I passed the examination. And I still get a little emotional about that because every Jamaican understands, of a certain generation, understand what that would mean if I didn't pass that scholarship, if I didn't get an opportunity to pass that scholarship. And so I've never forgotten that because for me, setting my sights as a physician, that was a central piece of who I sought to be as a doctor. Not just a doctor, but seeing the patient as a whole, as a person. And Dr. Golding did that. And I'm forever grateful for that.
Did you know before this episode that you wanted to be a physician?
I did. So by this time, I was 11 going on 12. And somewhere at the age of 10, I made that decision. Not quite sure all the details of how that happens. At a 10-year-old, you decide, I want to be a soldier, I want to be a fireman, I want to be whatever. But I definitely think that my mother's dedication as a nurse, working in remote areas, relatively speaking, where she was not only the nurse, she was also a midwife, she was also the dentist, she was also the doctor, because these professionals came around only so often. And so she had to sort of take on all that responsibility. You know, I write in the book that there are times when she would be called to deliver a child and, you know, over rough terrain and so forth, and she would disappear for days because she gets there and the baby didn't come. So what do? You stick around or come back home. And there are times when she would disappear into the bushes and only come back home after the child was delivered. So that sense of dedication, that sense of providing care for a segment of the population, I think I began to see that at age 8, 9, 10, and up. So the thought was being solidified back then.
Yes.
And then, of course, you know, my love for science and the exposure at Wilmer's Boys was really pivotal as well in terms of my direction.
How long did you spend at Manchester School? Incidentally, it's a school I taught language and literature for
Is that
several
right?
years. Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Wow. So I was there until the first part of third form. I forgot how it goes. And I think there were like three semesters or
Right.
three pieces.
Right.
So up to the first component of third form.
Which
And then
would end in December.
correct.
Right.
And then I transferred into third form at Woolmer's Boys, and finished there.
How do you compare the experiences of both? Because it would have been, if you went to sixth form, you went to sixth form
I
at
did not.
Wolmer's?
I did not.
Okay, so you had probably about equal time at both schools.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
How do you compare the experience?
Well, it's hard in many ways. In my mind, and maybe still today, Woolmer's is seen as being a little bit more prestigious than Manchester High School. But I didn't think in those terms at the time. I think the quality of the education I got at both places was quite equal, and I think I would have done equally well there as I would have at Woolmer's. It was the circumstances that, again, my mom coming back, living in Kingston by this time, and then saying it's time for you all to be gathered back together under one roof.
Okay.
But in fact, I was on a podcast recently, and they were asking about people of influence and people that I remember fondly. And one of the people I remember very fondly at Manchester High School that almost changed my mind in terms of my profession was a Mrs. Campbell, who taught history. And she made history come alive for me. And I still remember that because when you see the book, if you've when you have a chance to read the book, you see there's a very strong historical component as I tell the story of why African Americans need to embrace change and to move forward despite the subjugation that they've been under for so many years. So that historical piece sort of runs very clearly through the book, and I think I got that from Mrs. Campbell at Manchester High.
Okay. All right. So how did the transition from Wolmer's to the United States? How did that go?
Interesting question. It was tough because, quite honestly, I didn't want to go to the United States. I had a tremendous running battle with my mom, who says, "You, Fitzroy, you're going to the United States." And I said, it makes no sense to me in my 17, 18-year-old mind to go to. Why would I want to leave Jamaica? And it was an ongoing conversation. Ultimately, she won that conversation, obviously. But the transition was tough because first time on a plane, first time leaving the country, going to the big Apple, New York City, and finding my way, landing at Kennedy Airport by myself with an address written on a piece of paper that I held onto for dear life. Didn't know the people that I was going to meet with, didn't know anything about them except what my mom told me about them. And it was April, still very cold for a Jamaican kid. And so that piece was a little frightening, Not only that, but it wasn't sort of like I was going from Jamaica into an accepted college. My mom said, "You have to go figure this thing out. You figure out, you want to go to medical school, you go figure it out."
Okay. So when you arrived at JFK, were you meeting with family or strangers?
Actually, I met with the taxi driver, and I had to take a taxi driver to take me to a place called Cambria Heights in Queens, New York, one of the bars of New York. And when I got there, my host family was there. The good news, of course, is that my mom knew the host family. She had worked with them while she was in the States. The lady was a nurse, and she had a couple of kids living there and a boarder. So it wasn't total it was not a lack of some degree of understanding and knowledge. There were Jamaicans. My mom worked with the lady. She made the arrangements for me to get there and so forth. So that was huge in terms of helping me to navigate the whole American, New York City landscape, if you would.
Okay, so here you are by this time, what, 18-year-old?
18 going on 19.
18 going on 19, landed in the United States. You want to be a doctor. You were told to go there, and when you go there, to figure it out.
Yes.
So tell me, how did it start to figure out?
Well, first I had to get a job. I had to get the job. College didn't start right away. So the brilliance of my mother is that the folks that I stayed with had a daughter who also was pre-med. And so she understood, they understood something about the American system, something about how college went. But first I had to pay for room and board, so I couldn't start college right away. I worked multiple odd jobs. I worked in the fashion industry, unloading things on 7th Avenue in New York in Manhattan. I worked in a factory making plastic utensils for for eating in the South Bronx, and then I worked the midnight shift, and then at the end of the midnight shift, I went to work at a company called J.C. Penney's in Manhattan, behind the steam counter, serving food and then washing pots and washing dishes until about 3 o'clock, in which time I took the train home, got some rest, to get up again to go for my midnight shift in the Bronx. And I did that for 5 days. And then after about 10 months of doing that, I applied for college, City University of New York, which has something like 18 or 20 different campuses around New York City, essentially a state school. And I applied to college, got accepted, had my transcript from Wolmer's, and also had to find a job because I had to work and go to school because I essentially was on my own. And so I worked in a bank, cleaning the bank after hours, going home, studying to go to school again, riding my bike, because 35 cents for taking a bus at the time was a lot of money for me. So I got myself a bike, rode the bike to school, rode the bike to work, rode the bike back home and back to school again. So that was the process for most of my 4 years plus of undergraduate college.
Did you at any time during this process think that, what you had to do to begin your way into studies justified your not wanting to come?
I did not, because I think for me, once I got there, once the decision was made that is what was needed to be done, I was locked in.
Okay.
I'm here. It's a land of opportunity. I'm going to go for it. So everything else was secondary, if you would, to the fact that I'm now here. The issue around New York and going to New York for me was that at the time, the crime rate was such, and the temptations, it's called the Big Apple for a reason. The temptations, I feel like I'm not sure I would survive those circumstances. And so that was the bigger fear for me. How would I survive? Not from a standpoint of making a living so much as the moral challenges that I'll be faced in a situation where I was 18, I was almost 19, I was my own man, I could do what I want. Would I do what I want? And so that was the bigger concern for me. And it did present some challenges.
Were you ever tempted to do something?
Yes. Yes. We won't say what, but okay. I was tempted to do quite a few things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Clearly, you didn't act on the temptation.
I did not.
You didn't. How was that experience?
Which one? To get into med school?
Yes.
I would say, in a word, it was brutal.
Explain brutal.
So I went to school in upstate New York, city called Buffalo, New York. And Buffalo, New York was, the city itself was hostile to black folks. So you have that piece to deal with on the larger social scale. You are seen as the other. And it wasn't just black folks who were seen as the other. It was anyone who was not from the area. So even if you came from New York, and especially if you came from New York City, they weren't particularly enamored with your presence there. So here comes this black kid in a class of 145 with 10 of us being black. And the sense of, you don't belong here, you don't deserve to be here, we don't want you in our neighborhood, and we really don't care for you. So there was a city, and then there was a medical school. And the medical school was equally hostile because some kid from Long Island whose dad was a doctor, the granddad was a doctor, the mom is a doctor, you don't deserve to be here. And so the camaraderie that I expected of, we have arrived, let's all kumbaya, let's all get along, let's just get through this tough road together, was not the one that I met. The teachers, some of the professors were hostile. They didn't think I belonged there. And not just me, but
Others.
these black kids. It was rough. And I had, if we have some time to get into it, some experience that I had that I'd rather not dwell on, but I tell the story in the book because I see it as a potential point of encouragement to African Americans who are born and raised in the States, who have been suppressed for so long, to say to them, yes, I think I understand. Maybe I'm not quite like you because I didn't have generations of folks growing up here in the States, but I have been through the deep waters. I've been called names. My car has been painted. I've been held up and threatened with death, and I survived. So I went through this, you're going through this. Take a page out of my book to realize that you don't have to accept status quo. You can push ahead despite the perceptions that there are of you.
Wow. But you stayed.
I did stay. I
and
stayed.
you succeeded.
I did. I did.
You say that that black Americans, they are disproportionately, and these are just my words now, suffering in the health sector because of fear and distrust.
Yes.
And the distrust has its history in the Tuskegee experiment. How much is that still impacting both men's and women's health amongst African Americans today?
So it's again an important question and a larger question. The term health disparity and where does it come from? If I could step back a little bit, I talk about Tuskegee in the book, and I talk about Henrietta Lacks and her story, and her family's story. But the fact is that experimentation on blacks had been taking place for hundreds of years before Tuskegee. Tuskegee is perhaps the famous test this Tuskegee syphilis experiment.
Yes. And perhaps only because we found out.
Well, exactly, and because a whistleblower
Yes.
made it known. But the history of experimentation on blacks in prisons has and being used, the body snatches, if you would, where graves were dug up and the bodies were used in anatomy, the same anatomy type classes that I took in medical school. So there's this long history, but Tuskegee sort of stands so very central in so many African American minds. I was asked a few weeks ago, do I think this is just a generational thing that is passing? And I would like to believe that that's true, but I would argue that it is still with us. It is still with us when we see the whole COVID experience and what people talked about, and the sense that I don't trust the government. If they say this is the case, I don't trust them. They just want to do this. They want to use me for their purposes. So I think, and their African Americans would perhaps disagree with me on this. So I don't think this is a monolithic response. But in my view, in my practice at Howard University, Tuskegee was forever present when I talked about clinical trials.
How much of that experience was raised in black communities when they were being told to vaccinate for COVID?
So again, I think by the time COVID came around, I think that there was a larger understanding in the larger United States population that this was not just a myth, this was not something that people talked about, that it was real, and they realized that they had to address it. Did they address it effectively? In my mind, probably not. But it was being talked about. And you look at one of the premier journals, medical journals, the New England Journal of Medicine, where they began to talk about racism, institutional racism, microaggression racism, and so forth. So they talked about it, and they made substantial efforts, company by company, to try and address it. But I think it is such a deep-seated thing that this is something that has to be an ongoing conversation, and I think the country and pharmaceutical industries that I work with and work in need to understand that this cannot be a one-off, because the distrust is there. I like to believe that it's changing, and I think I'm seeing some changes within companies to meet African American patients part of the way, but it's going to be an ongoing sell, if you would, in terms of making the case.
Because of this distrust, though, what areas of health amongst both males and female, what areas are suffering most?
Well, I would like to argue that, again, you asked me most. It is systemic. Maybe I'm biased as an oncologist. I do think that in the oncologist space that there is a significant health disparity in terms of healthcare. Part of my challenge to African Americans is that you are right, you're absolutely right, it is true, and the facts bear it out. But part of the reason, I think, for some of this, and I don't want to seem like I'm blaming the victim, but my point is that you are an American. Let's forget the African for a minute. You're an American. And so you need to push for the things that are rightfully yours. And so part of what holds us back, I think, is the sense of fear not just distrust of the system, but the fear of the word cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Some people will not even say the word.
Yes.
Some people will not share the information with their families. I know somebody who died recently who was diagnosed with a horrific type of cancer. And it was only a week before she died that she was willing to tell the rest of her family what she had. Now, everybody suspected, but that information was not freely shared. And it becomes an important piece because so much of cancer is about genetics. And we don't like to talk about it because we hope it will go away. We hope that God will heal us. And that if we pray hard enough, everything is going to be okay. And the push that I have is you should do what you can for yourself. The system may be against you, but there are certain things that you can do. So I definitely think that when it comes to things like prostate cancer among black men, significant issue. The thought of having somebody putting a finger up your rectum,
Yes.
you know, who would allow that to happen? I mean, there are crass jokes, you know, told among patients about not putting things up their behinds.
Yeah.
Same thing with, say, a colonoscopy or sigmoidoscopy. Nobody's going to put XYZ up my butt because it might imply this or it might imply that. But I also think that denial. If I don't think about it, if it is not diagnosed, then it's not there, then I won't have to worry about it. And I think that that same mindset that you describe in Jamaica among men, and I have to say that it's not just black men, but obviously my target audience is black folks, and I want to change that narrative. So it very much is there. There was something else I wanted to mention about that. The fear, the distrust, the denial, the implications of what that might mean about you. But those, I think, are some of the main reasons, because then obviously, yes, the other thing is, well, if the solution to early diagnosis of prostate cancer is to remove my rectum, what does that do to my sexual health? You know, that's a part of my identity. I'm a man, you know. And so let's not go there. Let's just leave that piece alone, because I don't want to know, and if I do know, I'm not going to do anything about it because it might compromise my sexual performance.
So sex, the inability to perform sexually is a big fear around cancer in men.
Prostate cancer
Around prostate cancer.
specifically.